an absolute pleasure and honor to be speaking to you. And I finished it in 2 days. And I'm a very slow reader, so this is a record time for me.
That's a huge compliment. Thank you, Pooja. I appreciate that greatly. That's what a writer hopes to hear.
Absolutely. And the stories have been riveting. And what struck me was growing up in the 70s and 80s, one thing that struck me about you was you were very open about the way you lived your life.
Right.
So how come it took you so long to pen this?
Pooja, it's something I've thought about for decades. Then the pressures of life and work, etc., were there. But mainly, I wasn't clear how I wanted to tell the story. I'd made many attempts, and in the end, I'd throw them away, saying, "This is only a diehard fan would read this," because I wasn't clear the form in which I would tell this. As I've discovered the short story form, series of stories that add up to the totality of my life. Once I had that clarity, I sat down and wrote it. But also, I was debating how much should I reveal, how much should I tell? Because it's easy to talk about your glory and all the things you achieved and what a great life Kabir Bedi has had. But what are the crisis points in that life? What are the dilemmas I faced? What are the weaknesses I had? What are the mistakes I made? Was I going to talk about them as well? And once I became clear on how I was going to tell my story, I realized it was time to tell it the way it was supposed to be, the way it was. I speak it authentically as I could and let the chips fall where they may.
And so one thing about biographies is that they tend to fall into those emotional tropes of self-justification, gratification. There's none of that in your book. And you have penned on some very difficult moments. Which was one of the most difficult chapters, if I may ask? You've spoken about Protima Bedi, you've spoken about Parveen Babi, you've spoken about your son. I mean, those must have been really, really painful chapters to write. I mean, memories coming back, or was it cathartic?
Well, it certainly was cathartic because I had to relive all those times with these wonderful experiences I had with the women, the problems I had, the ultimate losses I suffered. And I think, the most difficult chapter was probably talking about my son. But the other chapters involving my emotional relationships were no less difficult because to reveal your inner self, the depths of your heart, is not easy. Because also in the case of my son, I had to reopen the wounds of his suicide and go back into that whole period from the time he told me he was planning to commit suicide. What does the father do in that situation? How do you deal with it? What follows? What are the conflicts that are created by that? How does a father deal with that? So all that, I had to reopen wounds that had healed and become scars. And now I had to go back into there and relive it. Fortunately, I had kept notes of the time because I wanted to communicate to Protima what was happening to our son. And those notes helped me greatly remember everything that happened in that period. But all those chapters were full of joy and pathos and great experiences. Even writing about my parents was wonderful because they have an extraordinary story of their own.
True. And especially about your parents. I mean, where did you draw the materials from? Because I had no idea that there were mystics, there were freedom fighters. I really had no clue because I remember, my daddy telling me, "Oh, Kabir Bedi, he comes from, Babaji's clan." So that was my connect. But so when you wrote about it all, I had no idea. Was that difficult to get the material?
Well, that wasn't that difficult because firstly, I'd heard it in family folklore. The story of how my father and mother came to India, became part of the freedom struggle, everything they did, how my mother became this mother figure for the Tibetan refugees and her relationship with the Dalai Lama and her becoming a nun and my father's spiritual experiences. That was all there in my memory from family folklore and what I saw. I also had a lot of the papers. I had many letters written by them, to them. In fact, 3 books have been written on my mother. And I certainly reading those books enriched my a lot of details in my mind that I wasn't aware of before, and I've given credit to those writers for those details. So that wasn't difficult to write in terms of finding the material. I had the material. I gave the writers, these three writers, almost all the source material, along with the other family archives that they accessed. So it was just a remarkable story to tell of two human beings who transformed themselves from being revolutionaries to being major religious figures. How does this happen? And what does it feel like to be a son of such parents who are so unusual? One a handpicked Satyagrahi of Gandhi, the other a communist. These are, it was important that people know not only what kind of background I had, but also what kind of people they were. How people lived in an age of idealism where they gave up everything for the sake of the freedom struggle, for the welfare of others. These are wonderful times that they lived in. I was born in this thing called the huts. There were literally 3 huts with a buffalo tethered nearby, no electricity, no running water, where all the leftists of the freedom struggle would gather. From Gyani Zail Singh, who became president, to Inder Gujral, who became prime minister, to Satish Gujral, the great artist, to Sheikh Abdullah, who became ruler of Kashmir. So these are all stories from my past, and it's a riveting story. Just that one chapter alone is worth the price of the book, you know.
Absolutely, it's a fantastic, fascinating, and also, charting your journey from St. Stephen's College, the biggest Beatles scoop, and very subtly asking John Lennon whether he did try substance. I was like, bravo! And
Yes.
then meeting people you admired, like whether it was Fellini, whose movies that you loved watching, and I did a slow clap when you spoke about Sabine giving it back to Gina Lollobrigida. I actually did a slow clap. I said, what was that like? And I must tell you, because for me, you were always Sandokan, and you were the Indian actor who was always in foreign films, because that was my image of you in the 80s. But so what was that all like?
Pooja, the success I had in Europe was quite extraordinary. I became a major star all over Europe, literally overnight, with the success of the Sandokan series. So when I went to Italy with Parveen, we were being lionized by everybody. We were on the magazine covers, all the magazine covers. We were on every television show, radio show, etc., newspapers, interviews, media blitz. In the middle of this, I'll recount that Gina story, where Gina Lollobrigida invited us for dinner. And at those days, Gina Lollobrigida and Sophie Loren were the 2 biggest Italian stars in the world. So to be invited by Gina was huge. And we went to a beautiful home in the Appian Way, and the idea was to meet her friends there. Then Gina would take us for a dinner at a private restaurant in Rome. From the moment we entered this wonderful home of hers, beautifully decorated with all these marvelous people, Gina was kindness itself to me, but refused to talk to Parveen. And this was creating a strangely tense situation for me, but I didn't want to be rude to Gina in her own house. Everyone's saying Sandokan was this, Sandokan was this. So I'm graciously accepting all these compliments while keeping an eye on Parveen. So I think, okay, we're going for dinner, it'll all sort itself out. It didn't, it got worse. When we went for dinner, it was Gina, the manager of Air India in Rome, Cecil de Mello, Parveen and me. And we went to this restaurant and we sat down. And as we sat down, Gina said, let's dance. So we danced one thing. It was ballroom dancing, foxtrot with band playing, dim lights, etc. And I'm thinking, my God, I'm dancing with Gina Lollobrigida, etc. Anyway, I got back to the table. And then Gina turns to Parveen with the imperious air of a queen. And she says, and you, my dear, what are you doing? Following the star? And I'm thinking, my God, what am I going to say? I don't want to be rude to Gina, but she's insulted my woman. Before I could think of anything to say, Parveen leaned forward and said, no, my dear, I'm with my man because I have a man.
Wow.
Gina said, oh, she's very clever. She's very clever. Then Parveen said, let us dance. So I got up with Parveen, went to the dance floor. I started dancing with her. She said, I'm leaving. I said, you're leaving the dance floor? She said, no, I'm leaving the restaurant. I said, how can you leave the restaurant? We're guests of Gina Lollobrigida. You can't leave the restaurant. So I'm leaving. She may matter to you, she doesn't matter to me. I said, but we are guests, didn't cut ice at all. And I realized that I was in a real soup. I mean, was I going to insult the star or was I going to honor my woman? And we got back to the table and Parveen picked up her bag and started walking off. And I realized I said, I have to stay with my woman because it is true. Gina was insulting to Parveen. So I leaned over to Gina and said, Gina, I'm terribly sorry, but we have to leave. I hope you understand why. No, no, dinner is coming. This is not right, etc. I said, Gina, I'm terribly sorry. I have to leave. And I left with Parveen. Those are the kind of dilemmas that one faced at the time of Sandokan, because, Parveen was a bigger star than me in India when we went to Italy. And suddenly she was seen as an appendage to the star. And it, in a way, it unsettled her. So when a person like Gina Lollobrigida says something to her, you're following the star, it absolutely wounded her to the core. And I can understand that. But it didn't make things any easier. I still had to make those choices and walk out of dinners with Gina.
True, sir. And also, I've seen whether it was Protima Bedi, whether it was Parveen Babi, I think you're drawn to women who are, they were independent, empowered. And that back in the day, in the 60s and 70s. Imagine now in the time of social media, they would have just taken their trolls head on. Imagine. And
right.
Imagine all this that you've recounted was in the time when we had no Facebook, we had no Twitter. Can you imagine what it would have been like had the social media, if all the circus that it is now today, imagine, sir.
Yeah, if people knew we had an open marriage, as I did with Protima, when it ultimately developed to that, it would have been a huge issue on social media. If people knew that my wife had streaked in public, it would have been a huge issue even today. But, Protima was this force of nature. She was just so full of energy, so full of creativity. It was hard to control her, and yet I loved her for that, for all the joy she gave me. But how a normal marriage becomes an open marriage, what are the things that lead to it? How do infidelities begin? How do they go out of control? How does it become an open marriage? All that I've explored in my book. And I think it's important for people to understand how that happens, why that happens, what it is to live in such a situation. And in my case, why it didn't work in the end. So all that I have recounted, I think, with great emotional honesty, not whitewashing any of my weaknesses or my mistakes either. But in that sense, we grew up together. We experienced life in a strange way. We were together for 6 years in a partnership that was moral and immoral, joyful and painful, dramatic and sublime, all those things. And I always count the blessings at the end of the day. What are the good things I got from that?
And totally, sir. Nowadays, as we were talking about this, these were times in the 70s we're talking about. Now, when people in public figures announce that they're splitting up, they're going their separate ways, you've seen the circus that unfolds.
Right. Right.
What do you have to say about that? It's everyone's personal choice. Relationships work out.
It is. And when you look at the Amir Kiran Rao separation, for instance, in a sense, I'm very glad they did it in an amicable way. Because normally, and I'm sure they went through that trauma before that also, because any separation, any parting is always painful, because it changes everything for you in your life, in your circumstances, in your friends, in your social circle. It changes everything. So, and not to mention the emotional turmoil you go through. So that is something that I'm sure Amir and Kiran also went through before they came to this amicable phase of separation. I have always prided myself on the fact that I've remained friends with all my ex-wives. In fact, in my book, I printed this wonderful picture of Nikki, who was my wife at the time, and me at a Christmas dinner, yes, attended by Protima and by Michelle, my American wife. Yes. And all three wives, sitting around a table, sharing laughs and good cheer. And I regard that as an achievement with pride, that I have kept good relationships with my ex-wife. I met all my economic responsibilities, but beyond that, things happen that separate you, whether it's circumstance or whether it's incidents or whether it's emotion. But when you do separate, it's important to remember the good things that brought you together and the goodness that exists in the other person. And I was able to do that, which I'm very proud of.
Awesome, sir, because as you've seen these days, many can't even manage to stay with the one that they've been living with for years. And it's just amazing because it takes a lot of emotional maturity, because I'm sure there are hurts. It's difficult to forgive people for what they have done. Like you've also spoken about Protima when you were away shooting for her first film and she, chose to be with someone else. I could see that anguish, the conflict, but then you chose to be with her because you loved her. But I was also reading this, Parveen Babi, because she's someone I've always admired, growing up in the 80s, because she was our ube, cool, chic chick, she was the bohemian and very fashionable. But I could sense the anguish in the chapter because you loved her immensely, but there was a helplessness because she was dealing with mental health. And today, recently, we have heard of many cases when, like a Sushant Singh Rajput, who also was dealing with that and chose to take that extreme step. So, I mean, back in the day when you knew it was there, but Parveen did not want help, that must have been a very trying time, because people suffering depression were called mad, as, she herself has been saying that they think I'm mad. And even when Sushant's suicide happened, people chose he's not mad. I mean, being depressed is not being mad. You're not mad. It's just a chemical imbalance in your head. I don't know why people don't accept it.
It's very important to remove the stigma around it, because the stigma itself creates so many complications. When a person gets afflicted with a problem like that, they fear the stigma. And therefore, they don't want to admit it. They don't want to reveal it. They don't want to have it treated in case the word gets out. And we live in a very judgmental world. So Parveen's fear was that if she went to a doctor, the doctor would tell somebody, and suddenly the whole industry would know and the industry would abandon her. This was part of her survival mechanism. And I could understand that. But not to admit it to yourself, not to admit it to your loved one, that was very difficult. Because you don't admit a problem, you can't solve it. You can't address it. You can't have it treated. And that was a continuing source of friction between Parveen and me. And I think one of the reasons why eventually she left me and came back to India after having moved to London with me, with the intention of both of us living abroad for the foreseeable future and making careers there. So it is very, very difficult to be living in that situation, because you are the protector, you are the caregiver. There were times when I thought, I've got to walk out of this. I cannot bear to continue this anymore. But she needed me, and I wanted to protect her. I wanted to heal her. So you continue, and then you get more of the same. And then it becomes almost an unbearable situation. When it comes to a crisis, you've got to be treated or else. So all that I've explored in great depth in my book. In fact, writing some very dramatic scenes that happened between us, which gives people a sense of actually being there almost, of seeing what is happening, feeling blow by blow, as it were, although no blows were actually inflicted by anyone. But it was, I had to tell it in a way whereby it is vivid for people. People call my book cinematic, but it's not structured like a film beginning to end. Each story that I have written has many scenes that are very vivid, so the whole thing feels very cinematic. People feel they're in it in some way. And that was the emotional experience I wanted to convey, because that's the only way you know what it is to live the life of an actor, and what it is to have lived the life that I lived, which was extremely dramatic in many, many ways.
Totally, sir. And you also spoke about the film industry, especially the Hindi film industry, how it was not inclusive then. People still, after what happened with Sushant and with a whole lot of others, keep saying it's still not an inclusive place. Do you see something having changed? Because even with Parveen, how she had to hide the aspect that she was suffering under the facade that she had to maintain, that she was okay, she was a big star. Do you think anything has changed over the years, or do you think it still goes? things remain?
Well, a lot of things have changed in the industry. The nature of filming, the technology has changed. Certainly the prices paid to actors have changed big time. They've gone up by a multiple of 100. The corporatization of Bollywood has made it a very different place. It's no longer a bunch of small family-run companies that have arrangements with distributors and become virtually the establishment. Today, the establishment are largely the corporates, and that has changed a lot of things in Bollywood. As far as nepotism is concerned, I think there is always nepotism in every industry. Doctors' sons become doctors. It is the fact that a star's son has access to being seen and heard is certainly an advantage, but it doesn't guarantee their success. It doesn't guarantee that they will work. Many cases have been there of people who launched their sons and it didn't absolutely work because either the films didn't work or the boy or the girl didn't have what it took to be a star. And there are equal number of cases of people coming from outside the industry who then made a place for themselves. So Analia Bhatt comes from within the industry, but there's Ranveer Singh who comes from outside the industry. There's Ranveer Singh who comes from Ranbir Kapoor who comes from the industry, but then there's a Priyanka Chopra who comes from outside the industry. So there's always cases on both sides. And of course, it's natural for people to want to follow the profession of their parents. It doesn't always work out, but I don't think it's out of control and I don't think it's out of balance. There may be cases where like Sushant Singh Rajput, where he felt it far more acutely. And I'm not entirely familiar with the facts of his professional life, but he did some great films, nevertheless. And his last film was a national award-winning film. So he would have had a great career if he had stayed. It's a pity he chose to go. But I understand why people get into those states, because it is a very dark place. And it takes a lot of energy to take yourself out of a dark place. And you have to be surrounded by positive people that lift you out of the dark place. In my chapter on my son, I certainly talk about everything I did to try and lift him out of the dark place. And let me say that today, the medicines that are available are much better than in those days. So there's far greater hope today that mental conditions can be treated, managed, and if possible, even healed in some cases, better today than it was, say, 20 years ago. But the emotional energy that those things drain from not only the afflicted person, but from the caregiver is something very painful to see. And yet there are moments of light and brightness and joy within it,
Absolutely. And we saw that in Parveen Babi's case as well, because as you said, her mood would switch. And I just felt that her end just didn't befit her because it was a very sad end. I remember it was just you, Danny.
It was such such a tragic end to a star who would be in the fantasy of millions. And it was so ironic that, and beautiful in a way, that the three men that she had loved the most, Danny, Mahesh Bhatt, and me, were all present at her funeral and all saw her cremated in a grave in the Juhu Muslim cemetery and said our farewells to her, each knowing her as only each one knew, each feeling a pain that only they knew. She deserved a better end. And yet, she, in her life, she had become one of the most iconic actresses because she created a completely different image. And the tragedy of Parveen Babi was that she was suffering the most mentally at the height of her glory. And dealing with that, you can't imagine the strains it creates.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely.
and she ultimately became a victim of that.
Absolutely. So I totally get that because it's happened with a whole lot of people, and I just hope we do sensitize ourselves towards this.
We should, and the stigma should be removed. The stigma should be removed.
Absolutely.
It's a mental condition that can be treated like a physical condition,
Absolutely.
and there are medicines to control that, manage that.
Absolutely. And talking about Hollywood, sir, and since like it was you and Shashi Kapoor and you were actually our first true blue crossover stars, a lot has changed since then. Now you look at Priyanka Chopra. There's a lot of inclusivity now, and also playing Sandokan. I mean, worked in your favor also, but also did not work in your favor because no one could see you beyond anything but him.
Ultimately, they did. But yes, you're right. That was the great dilemma I faced after the success in Italy. But let me come back to the earlier part of your question. It is true that they were not writing roles for Indians in those days in Hollywood. And that is the biggest problem I faced when I went to Hollywood. So I had to tell my agent, okay, if they're not no roles for Indians, get me any foreign roles. And Hollywood is so insular that any foreigner can play any foreign role according to them, you know. So that's what I did. In my film with Michael Caine, which is my first big film, I played Tariq Prizeman in The Thief of Baghdad. I played The Prince with Roddy McDowell. In The Bold and the Beautiful, I played the Moroccan Prince. And all these things got me worldwide fame. It was only in the James Bond film, Octopussy, where I played the villain, that finally I was given an Indian role. And I played this Sikh character and played him with great dignity, even though he was the villain. And that was the first time I was actually correctly cast in Hollywood. So it was much more difficult then. Today, inclusivity and diversity is an issue, and I'm very glad. It makes me very, very happy to see the success of people like Priyanka Chopra going out there and finding roles that work for them, even though, as she says, you have to be slightly ethnically ambiguous to be cast. And she's got that quality. She's got that quality, and she's done some wonderful films out there. And she's the biggest Indian star internationally today. And I supported her from the very first film in which she acted, where I acted opposite her, a film called The Hero by Anil Sharma directing. So, and she launched my book because we have this wonderful relationship, and I'm most grateful to her. She's a terrific girl. And you know, right now I've got my granddaughter Alaya, who's in the film industry, who just won the Filmfare Award for Best Debut Actress. But a girl like her could also act internationally. There's no reason why Indian actors can't act internationally, because our roles are being written. So it is easier today. However, let me say, Pooja, it is never easy to be in the film industry. It is the hardest film industry to live in and to survive. I've always said that anyone who survives 25 years in this business deserves an Oscar for survival. You know,
I agree. I second
it's
that.
a very slippery slope climbing the road to stardom in India or abroad. But to some degree, it is easier because roles are being written for us.
Absolutely, sir. And also meeting your people you admired, whether it was Fellini, there was, Michael Caine you worked with. I mean, the list is endless. I think I've forgotten. I'd made a list and I've forgotten the name.
No, Audrey Hepburn
was your starstruck moment. Audrey Hepburn, yes.
Audrey Hepburn was just, I admired her. She was one of the actresses of the golden age of Hollywood. She'd won Oscars and BAFTAs, and I'd seen her in so many Wait Until Dark and Breakfast at Tiffany's and all these wonderful films. And so when she came and sat down next to me at this party in Italy, it was one of those surreal moments that the actress that you adore the most in the world is sitting right next to you and wanting to talk to you. And she was very sensitive even then to the suffering of people in underdeveloped countries, of children starving, of food starvation in the world, the underprivileged. And she became an immensely huge humanitarian and was given the Presidential Medal of Honor for her work as a humanitarian. So meeting Audrey Hepburn, meeting Fellini, whose films I stood in line as a student to see when in college, meeting Bertolucci, who directed Last Tango in Paris. And these were great people to meet. Meeting Sean Connery, he was, for me, the greatest Bond ever. It still is. Daniel Craig comes a very close second, but he was the quintessential Bond, and not only a quintessential Bond, he was an actor that showed you can move beyond a genre like Bond and still do fantastic performances in all kinds of in gangster films, in science fiction films, in historical films, all of which he did and excelled. So meeting people like that and knowing people like Michael Caine, who came from a working class background and made it to the highest ranks of Hollywood cinema, and yet had this wonderful down-to-earth humility about him, where he befriended you and talked to you as though he was on the same level as you, whereas we looked up to him. So met a lot of beautiful people along the way, including philosophers, including teachers, including the Dalai Lama and J. Krishnamurti, the philosopher. And all these meetings are chronicled in my book, and I've shared what happened in these magical moments. Yes, I'm glad you're holding it up. I'll also hold it up. Stories I must tell, the emotional life of an actor.
Yeah,
and
it can be a film,
full of all the things I've been talking to Puja about and much more.
It can be a movie, it can be made into a film.
I'm sure it'll find its place as a film or a series or whatever. I'm sure it will. It's got a lot of material in there. And my life, which I think is quite an amazing life in some ways.
Absolutely. And I would say it's a very well-lived life, despite the personal losses, financial losses, emotional
reverses,
pain.
And how to rise from it, yeah.
It's totally,
and how to rise from those reverses,
That must have taken a lot, sir, because, it just breaks your spirit.
It does. I mean, for all my successes I had in Hollywood, I also, I talk about how I came to a point where I faced bankruptcy. What does it take to go from being a superstar to being bankrupt? That again is a journey full of interesting drama, scenes, events that happen, mistakes you make along the way, which I've shared in great detail with great relish, and how to never let adversity get you down, and how I resurrected my career. From there, went on to Italy and came back to Bollywood, and how life continues in many dimensions. All that and more in this book that I wrote.
Fantastic, sir. And now they're planning to make a Sandokan with a Turkish star. Let's see how that pans out. But you are everyone's Sandokan for life. And amazing.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'm sure Kanya Man will be a worthy successor, and I wish him well. And I think Sandokan will benefit by being made with the new technology. But people that saw the old Sandokan will have their own memories of it and their own attachments. So let's see what the future brings.
Absolutely. And so have your daughter and granddaughter read the book, and what did they have to say? Parting shot.
They both loved it. And Alaya particularly was very vociferous in her praise, because she said, I've heard these stories off and on through family, but I never knew it in such detail. I never knew you lived such a varied life with so many tapestries and colors inside it. I had no idea of some of the scenes that you went through. And I was so touched by how openly you shared your life with everybody. So that's the highest praise from Alaya and from my daughter Puja, but also from my ex-wife Nikki. If my ex-wife Nikki strongly endorses my book, I have to say I must have done something right.
You have, and also the fact that, as I said when I started the interview, was you've lived your life openly. So, because a lot of time with people is that they tend to hide things, but whether it's a relationships, whether it's a marriage, you just lived life the way it was. So the book is like a worthy read, because it's honestly, I'm very impressed. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much, Puja. Appreciate my chat with you. Love chatting to you. And I hope people have learned more about me through our chat and even more through my book. Thank you, Puja.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.